So for our last session, I am honored to moderate this panel. I guess you heard a little bit from me on the last one. But two of our four panelists are going to be appearing virtually. So I guess I will introduce them first. I guess they're not on the screen, or you can see their names and photos. So we'll be hearing from Jeff Reeves, who will be appearing virtually. Jeff's actually a former Vice President of Research at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Hi, Jeff. He is now the Senior Washington Fellow for the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and an Assistant Professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, the U.S. Naval War College. And the other person on screen is who we had hoped to have with us in person, Jeremy Paltiel, also an advisor with IPD and Professor Emeritus at Carleton University. To my left is, and I apologize if I don't pronounce the name correctly, Dimitar Gueorguiev, Associate Professor and Director of Chinese Studies from Syracuse University and a China Fellow at the Wilson Center. And to my far left, Juliet Liu, Assistant Professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC, one of our sponsors. So we have four distinguished panels. We're going to be talking about, as it says on this, or said on the screens, the Sino-American competition under a new White House. So we hear a lot about strategic rivalry and defense. It's really become a touchstone of the China-U.S. relationship. As we're going to talk about the defense relationship, we'll talk about what things mean under Trump 2.0 under a couple of other rubrics. We've heard a lot about Trump 2.0 this morning and this afternoon and what it's going to mean for the broader relationship. But particularly, I think it's fair to say the strategic rivalry and defense has become an overriding theme in this relationship. So therefore, I would like to start our discussion on a defense-related question and put the question to Jeff. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists kind of an opening question, and they can respond in as long or as short as they want. So Jeff, as I noted, you're working currently in the defense and military environment with the U.S. Naval War College. Where you sit, how does the U.S. DoD currently define and approach military competition with China? And how might this doctrine change? So is it politically driven? Is it driven by the military perceptions? Will it change under a Trump administration, or will it remain the same? And if it does change, what factors do you see coming forward that are going to influence this change?
Great. Thanks for the questions, Hugh. Can you hear me? All good? Okay, great. First, let me kind of preface my remarks by saying this is not a reflection of U.S. policy. I do work for the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy. Everything I'll say here is just my own perspective on the issues at hand. Actually, when we talk about what this might look like on Trump 2.0 kind of defense strategy cooperation, we have a blueprint to look back on. We have the first Trump administration, where thinking about China fundamentally changed on the defense side of things, right? With the introduction of this idea of great power competition, replacing the global war on terror, for example, as being the primary driver behind American strategy. That was a Trump administration initiative. It was an innovation of that particular a moment in time, one that the Biden administration has largely continued. So if we look at the key documents on the defense side of things, so the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy, kind of U.S. Big Picture Strategy 101, we see a fundamental change in the way that administrations have started talking about China. Moving away from this idea of having some sort of balanced relationship where we find opportunities for engagement and competition where necessary, towards one where we're talking much more about China as a near peer, or in some instances as a pacing challenge, right? So the idea here is not that United States and China should find opportunities to work together, but that we look to the PRC as a measure of where we need to develop, at least, when I'm talking about I'm talking about from the United States perspective, where we need to develop our doctrine, where we need to develop new weapon systems, where we need to think about countering Chinese capabilities, when we need to think about, for example, force posture and relationships across some of the key arenas where we have competition with China, and competition being the buzzword, right? We talk a lot about competition in this Biden administration. We can anticipate that that'll be a central point of Trump doctrine going towards China. Competition, though, is not just about finding ways to, counter China. It's about managing risk, right? Fundamental to that idea is that the China's growing global presence is a risk to American national interests, right? That's baked into the idea of strategy. More at the operational level, what we're starting to see, and here I'm really talking about from the military side, the geographic combatant commands, right? Is this internalization that China's, the competition, the risk of China is multi-sector and it's global, right? And it expands the Indo-Pacific, obviously the focus of this conference, and a major focus of American policy. But one can see it across all the different geographic combatant commands. So we're talking about 6 in total: Southcom, AFRICOM, Northcom, EUCOM, CENTCOM, and I'm missing one, EUCOM, I think. So we're not talking about Indo-PACOM right now. These other areas, right, where you talk about how do we think about America's main challenges in places like Africa? How do we think about it in terms of South America? China is central to the way that we think about all these challenges, despite the fact that it's a non-geographic player. I was in a briefing this morning about Southcom, and the main issue there is how does the United States compete with China around base access and base development in places like Peru or Chile or Argentina, right? When we see the combatant commanders come out and they talk to Congress about what are their priorities at the theater level, they're talking about countering violent extremism. They're talking a little bit less about maybe Russia, North Korea, depending where you're looking. Now, of course, more with North Korean involvement in Europe. You hear about that in EU Command. But central to all of these is the idea that China is a major, major competitor, and that it presents a security and defense challenge to the United States globally. I think you can see that across the functional geographic combatant commands as well. So when we talk about Cybercom, when we talk about SOCOM, Special Forces Command, right? When we talk about Spacecom and Stratcom and Transcom, these areas where the United States has built up a functional, area of focus. China's front and center of how we think about space, about how we think about our cybersecurity. And that's, again, across different regions. Now, Indo-PACOM is at the center of everything. So if we think about China's challenge in the, outside of Asia as being primarily around areas like defense, informational and economic, so those parts of, national interest and national power that the military likes to talk about as DIME, right? D-I-M-E. In the Indo-Pacific, it's really about the military part of that. We're really thinking about how to maintain American primacy around our naval presence, around, again, space, Army. The Marines are thinking about how to revise their doctrine based on a potential fight against Chinese forces in the Pacific. So this is really the center of gravity for how not only the Trump administration 1.0, but the Biden administration has been thinking. And it's going to be the, I think, underlying kind of conditions that set Trump's strategy moving forward. How things will develop, I think there's basically a 2-level game going on here. One is around personnel. Who's going to have the Secretary of Defense position? We're seeing that play out in real time. So there's absolutely no way to say whether or not my new boss will be Hegseth or somebody else. We'll see how that plays out. But the other side of this is the institutional side. All these conditions that I just described, right? Those don't change overnight, and they're a constant across different administrations. So we can expect that, for example, in AFRICOM, in Southcom, in Europe, China will continue to be a focus of American defense and strategy development, regardless of who sits in that position. Now, I think the one thing I'll say before I turn it back to you is that a lot depends on how involved kind of the level 1 and the level 2 sides of this game become integrated. If the new leadership at the Department of Defense or the Joint Chiefs decide that they want to have a direct input into the way that we're setting strategy, not necessarily based on national security or national interest, but the politics of things, then we really don't know how that's going to develop. If we're given the opportunity to just to kind of continue at the pace that we're setting right now, addressing some of the strategic issues that we've identified, then I think there's going to be more of a kind of status quo. Obviously, I think the competition side is going to grow in intensity, mostly because President-elect Trump has said that he intends to increase, a focus on China in terms of defense. But yeah, I think there's a lot we don't know. But we can look, I think, for some precedent back to the first Trump administration and understand that those conditions don't change overnight.
Just by way of follow-up, I mean, this China obsession, I guess, if I could put it that way, that you suggest sort of permeates all military thinking. Is this driven primarily by the military picking up political signals of the mood of the country, or is it based on empirical observation? China's building aircraft carriers, China's got more ships, China this, China's going to the moon, et cetera, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's almost exclusively about capabilities, but not in terms of just hard military capabilities. Certainly, that's the rationale in the Indo-Pacific. When we look around, what are the challenges around Taiwan? What are the challenges around the South China Sea? We're looking specifically at that point in a traditional kind of military security lens. When we look at other regions, it's much more about what China is doing in other areas, right? What it's doing on the economic side, what it's doing on the political side. The thing is, both the Trump and the Biden administration have raised economic issues. They've raised technological issues. They've raised issues like telecommunications up to the level of national security. And the United States, unfortunately, has overinvested in its Department of Defense and underinvested in its Department of State. So when we look at who's going to be the lead agency around securing American interests outside of the Indo-Pacific, it's always the DoD that's kind of holding the bag, going, well, I guess we'll do it because no one else can, right? So unless we really fundamentally reconsider how we approach national security and fund a real honest-to-God interagency approach, it'll always be the DoD that sits there and says, okay, well, diplomacy is important, we'll do military diplomacy. Engagement is important, we'll do military trainings and exercises and outreach. But no, fundamentally, I think this is an honest-to-God capabilities assessment. One that kind of spans the gamut, right? All the way up to the development of new nuclear forces in China, all the way down to what China is doing in what we call the gray zone, right? So the non-kind of kinetic area of competition, where we're thinking about Chinese investing in port access or investing in student exchanges that could result in political influence. Like all of those things are a consideration of national security. And in fact, they're going to inform, I think, an American strategy that's predicated on developing really dense forces in the Indo-Pacific, but also really using special operations in areas like Africa and Latin America, because American special operations are fundamentally designed to influence outcomes under that kind of gray zone criteria.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me move to sort of another aspect of this, and that's, so we've talked about military preparation, military capabilities, and I guess very closely related to that is the whole question of technological rivalry, export controls, and what the U.S. is doing. So I'm going to turn to Dimitar on this one. So lately, we've seen a lot of new rules and commitments coming out of the Biden administration. I mean, maybe they're trying to get them out the door before the Trump administration arrives. I'm not sure. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. But they relate, I mean, we've seen the Huawei and 5G and so forth, but of course there are new rules coming out through the Department of Commerce all the time, tightening export controls. So do you have any theories as to why this is happening now, what's likely to happen under the Trump administration, and how is Beijing going to react?
Great, thank you. First, I want to thank Bijan and the organizers for having me. A lot of people have been complaining about the weather here in Ottawa. I live in Syracuse, so it's just as pleasant there. Yeah, thank you for the question, Hugh. Let me just kind of step back for a moment and talk about some of the most recent announcements, just as a backdrop. Hopefully it's helpful for the discussion, but Commerce just announced new export control rules that are designed, as most of you well know, at kind of limiting China's ability to manufacture advanced semiconductors and also accessing the tools needed to produce those advanced semiconductors. And I guess it was a pretty long document, so I'll just point out 4 kind of key things that are worth mentioning. One is they plugged some big holes, which allowed kind of third-party producers to make tools outside of, let's say, the Netherlands or Japan, and then sell them to China. So they plugged that hole. They expanded the discussion to include memory chips, which are slightly different than the logic and power chips, and are probably less exciting, but increasingly important when it comes to artificial intelligence, because the nature of chip development does have physical boundaries in terms of how small you can get, and to kind of expand the processing power of the most recent iterations of the AI chips, you need to have a lot of memory. So memory is now important, and I think the U.S. is taking that more seriously. They expanded the entity list. So the entity list is this kind of redundant list that says, this group or this company is on a no-no list, so don't deal with them. And then they kind of reinterpreted or expanded the interpretation of something called the foreign direct product rule, which is a way of saying, you can't, like if Tim Hortons was to buy a Big Mac and then wrap it around in a Tim Hortons and sell it as Canadian, that would not be okay. But now with this new interpretation, you can look at how they cook that Big Mac and say, well, it's an American style of cooking, so that's also not okay. So it's a very kind of expanded interpretation of how the United States can use its dominance in the market, in R&D, and kind of at the pinnacle of this industry to really constrain China's ability to try to get up there as well. Right? And so Hugh's question is, why now? What's going on? And I guess I have two ways of interpreting. I don't know which one is right, and probably both of them are to some extent right. One is, getting them out the door while they can, or a slightly different version of this is to kind of have all these little tiny fish hooks on Trump that tie him into kind of Biden-era policy, and we see this across the board. So the recent approval for Ukraine to use ATACMS and other U.S. weapons in Russia, the rolling out of promised funds, like just most recently, this is really good for me, $6.9 billion to the Micron Corporation to build a semiconductor plant just 15 miles north of our university. And so, and this is, I think, part of that story of trying to kind of tie Trump to existing policy. Obviously, he's not going to like that. He's going to break those hooks off somehow. So that's one version of it. The other one I think is probably more revealing is that existing policy really hasn't been working. And I think, whether you like Trump or not, it's worth stepping back and kind of realizing that whatever was the idea in Ukraine of kind of slowly kind of spoon-feeding resources doesn't seem, I don't know, people may disagree, it doesn't seem to have been particularly effective. And now, why do it now at this late stage? When it comes to export controls in particular, the policy, again, has been incrementally kind of tightening up, but in many respects too slowly. The fact that you have the foreign direct product rule and an entity list that is really doing the same thing kind of underscores that the foreign direct product rule isn't really working as it should be, and so you have to kind of label and shame companies. The way it's also been kind of implemented so far is that the U.S. government kind of looks and sees, oh, this company has reached an advanced status, and now we'll put it on the entity list or the no-no list. But by that time, it has achieved that status. It's bought all the infrastructure. It's developed the production line. So what's the point of sanctioning it after it's already operational? So it's kind of dysfunctional. In China, obviously, it's not ignorant. It's not blind. It can see these things 6 months, 9 months in advance, and it's been stockpiling well in advance of any rules being assigned. So clearly something isn't working, and I think that we could say that that's true across policies. Again, this is not specific criticism of the Biden administration. It's just the fact that we're seeing things come out so quickly right now, to me, reveals that probably there's some dissatisfaction in how effective they've been thus far. And so what's Trump going to do about it? I think he's going to adopt something much simpler. He likes tariffs. He calls himself the tariff man. He is going to be much less, I think, courteous to either domestic stakeholders or international stakeholders, whether domestically that would be the big companies that have an interest in maintaining sales to China, but internationally this includes the TSMCs, the Samsungs, the SK Hynexes. He's going to be much less concerned about stepping on their toes or trying to kind of build them into the policy. So we're going to have a lot more kind of very clear-cut, simple, rules that say you can't do anything with China, or anything that comes from China is going to incur a big tariff. China's reaction to this is, well, they're going to preempt as much as they can. They've already stockpiled a lot, so I don't think that they're too worried about what's coming, or they're not going to be surprised by it. But I think what they're going to try to do is take advantage of the fact that a lot of stakeholders, particularly internationally, are going to be really upset that the United States is taking these kind of unilateral actions. They're probably going to offer more market access, more tariff-free trade, and try to kind of build wedges between American partners. And I think we should just kind of anticipate what's going to happen. I think Canada is probably not as directly implicated in the technology competition side, or particularly the semiconductor side of this, but a lot of Canada's partners are. I mentioned Korea already. They have a pretty large footprint in China, but they also have a large industry that sells to China. So whatever hurts Canada's partners will probably hurt Canada as well. But we can chat more about kind of Canada's potential opportunities in this new Trump stage, or kind of in this new Trump era of technology competition later on. I'll hold those comments for later.
I must say I'm a bit confused. I'm not sure how Trump's threat of tariffs is going to affect technology transfer, which is what the export controls are all about. I mean, what about U.S. You mentioned Samsung and TSMC and various companies in Japan, Korea, and so forth. What about U.S. business? I mean, presumably one of the reasons what slowed down the administration a bit is the fact that U.S. business has a strong stake in some of this trade, right? I mean, and it comes down to a definition of dual-use technology and how potentially harmful it might be if that gets into the hands of the Chinese and so on.
Well, I'd say the approach right now has been to slow China down by, again, controlling technology exports to China of the highest end, but then still allowing almost kind of unfettered activity on the lower legacy end. Right? And so that is, first of all, where is the threshold, right, between legacy and leading edge? How do you police it? How do you enforce it? And it's been really complicated. And I think trying to make sure that everybody is on board and finds a way to participate while also complying has resulted in very complicated and very slow-moving controls on the U.S. side, which for big companies, I think, and their lawyers, they can figure those out over time. But it hasn't been particularly effective. I just don't necessarily see the Trump administration continuing that approach. I think they are going to take a more simple kind of anything related to China is off the table, including some of the legacy stuff, or at least the threshold is going to be moved much higher than where it is right now, and higher means older. In terms of tariffs, how would that impact China's participation in the technology market? A lot of products that we import, or the United States and Canada probably imports from the Chinese, have chips in them, have technology in them, embedded in them. If you raise tariffs on all of that, then even that kind of lagging edge technology that the Chinese have been able to continue participating in, that becomes more expensive, right? So I think that is one way that China gets hurt from tariffs on technology.
Okay, so the objective seems to be to slow China down and damage China. So let's turn to China and its response. And Jeremy, I'm going to come to you on this question. So Dimitri's talked about Trump and tariffs, and we know that tariffs apparently are part of his transactional nature. You can put tariffs on, but you can take tariffs off if you do the right thing, like patrol the border or whatever it happens to be. But also, he's not a fan of multilateralism, as we know. It's one-on-one, big stick, and so on. So does this create a vacuum? I mean, China has been moving a bit on, or quite a bit actually, on the whole multilateral front in terms of both participating in international organizations, trying to shift the international rules, trying to create some rules itself. How do you see this rivalry, this deepening rivalry, this concerning rivalry, frankly, that we've just heard about? How is this going to affect global governance?
Well, I think global governance is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I think global governance is very much at play. But if we look at the Chinese approach to Trump, they have a kind of two-sided approach to him. On the one hand, they actually like his transactional nature because they believe that they can make deals with him. And if we're talking earlier about the Defense Department, right, one of the things that Trump is on record is he doesn't want kinetic confrontations. He says that in every theater. So that in that sense, that's something that the Chinese actually look forward to at a certain level. The other thing that they like about Trump is that he's not values driven. And that's really important here because if you look at the principles that China has put forward for managing major power relationships, that they have played a lot of emphasis. China has this kind of also dual nature of foreign relations, which is to say relationships among major powers are one level, and then there's global governance and relationship with everybody else at another level. And they try to balance them out. And so what China sees is that on the one hand, there's an opportunity to make deals with Trump maybe on some of the bilateral issues that Trump might settle for things that look like gains on issues while yielding on values-based issues like democracy and human rights, which they don't want to hear about. And on the other hand, it creates a field for China to play its game that it now wants to emphasize of not just multilateralism, but international norms. One of the things that's interesting is that China emphasizes UN-centered diplomacy. So what we might see, and international institutions and multilateralism. So what we might see is a two-sided thing where China works really hard bilaterally and symmetry through face-to-face negotiations to get some kind of stabilizing deals with the United States, which Trump might take home and crow about. While on the other hand, the fact that some of those deals actually erase or ignore, get around global norms and rules will then be sold to the rest of the world, the global South, but not just the global South, middle powers, the EU, and other places as places where we need to deal on safeguarding multilateral institutions and the United Nations from Donald Trump. And this, for some countries, might be attractive. Some countries which are not in the global South necessarily, which have not necessarily always been on board with Chinese plays with the global governance, might be forced to look to China to help safeguard international institutions when you have a U.S. president who doesn't care.
Okay, thank you. Juliet, let me come to you. So I know your area is infrastructure, development assistance, and the environment. So how is this rivalry going to play out in the region? We're talking about the Indo-Pacific region in terms of these areas. As we've talked about ASEAN not wanting to choose sides. There is a development assistance relationship with some of those countries. There's certainly an environmental impact. This competition presents certain dilemmas. How do you see the impact of the competition through the lens of assistance and the environment playing out in the region?
Yeah, well, I would like to maybe suggest that these are areas in which we can think a little bit longer term, partly because unlike trade, they don't seem to be a focus of Trump. He can't keep many focuses. So, in this, potentially, I think these are areas we can think bigger picture, and that Canada specifically, I think, is positioned, maybe even should feel itself very responsible to think longer term. if we look at a longer term horizon, we're experiencing a crisis of confidence in the liberal international order, a rise of populism that is not just in the US. It's very much also happening here in Canada and across the world. What do the ideas of security, sometimes I feel that the idea of security is batted around and used strategically. What does that mean vis-a-vis the idea of interdependence, globalization or globalization? Yeah. In what sense is independence a weakness, and where can it become an opportunity still? And so if we look at development financing specifically, we see a really specific story that's a little bit different from things like trade agreements. We actually see a place in which infrastructure fuels all other aspects of development. It's something that matters from everyone, from political elites who want to do ribbon cutting because it makes them look important and successful, all the way down to ordinary people, and especially for businesses. The thing is, infrastructure doesn't pay for itself, and for the last about 40 years, it's kind of not been paid for by anybody, right? There's been a decline in that funding. And so there's a global infrastructure funding gap of an estimated $15 trillion up to 2040, 2035, whoever's calculation you're using. China has been one of the only countries funding infrastructure, and it also has become one of the countries that's best at effectively and quickly building infrastructure. And so after years of disinvestment in physical infrastructure, but also in funding social and infrastructure and development programs, 2008, the global financial crisis, was this sudden wake-up call, I think, for China when China started realizing what a lot of the rest of the world had learned, which is that rich countries still need to invest in the economic security of their neighborhood in order to preserve their own economic security. They need to invest in the places they want to sell things if they want to keep selling them their own goods. It also started realizing that maybe it needed to step up and be a regional leader, if not a global leader. And so I really see China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was announced in 2013, as coming out of ways in which the G7, the OECD, were not actually providing for a major demand, which is infrastructure finance. And China, from 2008 to 2021, they financed an insane amount of money into the developing world. They sent almost $500 billion of development finance into projects around the world. And for reference, that is about 83% of what the entire World Bank was lending out in those same years. So China really suddenly became a major provider of capital. And of course, a lot of that capital that it was providing was also fueling its own companies going out for the very first time to build roads, power plants, ports, railways. It precipitated a huge rush on the part of Chinese companies, Chinese lenders. They were under pressure by the Chinese government. It also precipitated total panic from the US and other countries around the world who had been kind of in the place of traditional donors of infrastructure and had, I would argue, didn't have their eye on the ball and were not providing money where their mouths were. And so, the Trump's first administration initiated the Blue Dot Network. Biden initiated the Build Back Better for the World, which kind of flopped and got entangled in domestic hang-ups, but then revived itself like a zombie into the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. But it's been completely underfunded compared to what China has provided. And the fact is that the G7 don't have the type of capacity that China has to build roads and power plants as quickly and as effectively as they can. So it's a place in which there's a huge amount of demand globally. China can provide a lot in terms of money and hands on deck. And I think that the US and other partners can't really respond in the ways that China can. So it's a place in which true collaboration really makes sense. Now, there were a lot of ways in which the huge rise in funding of infrastructure that China initiated was not great for anyone. There was a lot of pushback for the social and environmental costs that host countries experienced. It was also very bad for Chinese lenders and Chinese companies. A lot of companies ended up with flopped projects. A lot of lending has actually caught China was accused of trying to trap investor countries in debt traps, but it's been shown that a lot of that lending was actually not great for Chinese lenders. So I think that the lesson learned here is that a rapid rush into these things is not a great idea. It has a lot of costs. But there's a lot of opportunities for bringing China in a more responsible way, a more well-paced way. And the fact is the demand for China's skills and capital is not going away. And China's overcapacity in these areas, its need to invest abroad is not going away either. And I think this translates into some opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more when we get into, you know, what maybe should Canada's response be in this area. But I do eventually want to come back to the idea about interdependence and being potentially an opportunity and not just a weakness or a vulnerability for all parties involved.
Well, thank you. Actually, on that point, that was kind of the next question that we had agreed that we would take these viewpoints that have been brought out, the military, the technical, the global governance, and the development assistance and the infrastructure issues that have been laid out, and look at it through the prism of Canada, since we're talking about Canada and the Indo-Pacific and so on. So perhaps we go back in reverse order. So you led off a little bit as to what this might mean for Canada, what opportunities it might present, or what challenges. So perhaps I could ask you to comment further, Juliet.
Yeah, so this is an area where I think actually we're going to see a lot of benign neglect from the Trump administration. Trump has chosen a bunch of China hawks. They are not people that know a lot about Southeast Asia. Trump is going to be pretty distracted by the Middle East. He's going to be pretty focused on his fantasies that he can quickly end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as we've seen with the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, efforts to counter China in Southeast Asia, especially when it comes to infrastructure spending, have been very lame. They've kind of flopped, been underfunded, have not had the momentum that they would need to come anywhere close to the Belt and Road Initiative. And so in these areas, I think it presents the opportunity to think long-term, because it requires, I think, countries like Canada to actually go beyond just trying to counter whatever destruction Trump's administration might bring, and actually think about making a case for the idea of interconnectedness not being a choice, but as just being the reality that we have to deal with. It was brought up earlier today. Bill McKinnon was saying that, I think that was your name. It was brought up that Australia has successfully framed domestic prosperity in terms of engaging Asia. So yeah, Carlo Dade said that that's not really possible. We can't really do that in Canada, but I think if Australians are able to be convinced that domestic prosperity can be rooted in engaging Asia, I certainly think there's a chance in Canada to convince everyday Canadians. And I think that's something that Canada is positioned to do, because Canada has a lot of stake in multilateral institutions and in engaging itself, providing itself as an alternative market and lender to the U.S. and to China in a lot of these spaces. And I think engagement on the environment is potentially another area that Canada really can think longer term on as well. I mean, you see a lot of parallels in environmental politics to what I've just described in infrastructure, where China went from being a laggard, China went from being kind of someone who, you know, was environmentally a bit backwards, very polluting, had a bad history of overseas engagement and investment, being very high impact on the social side and the environmental side, but has made huge strides in terms of being involved in UN environmental events. It was the president of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that was co-hosted by Canada in Montreal in 2022. China has become one of the world's largest investors in renewable energy. It's, whether we like it or not, the critical minerals and critical mineral supply chains are 80 to 90% going through China in one way or the other. And those are going to be essential for the just energy transition. And China is one of the largest climate finance providers in the world. It's the 5th largest climate finance provider by certain calculations. And so just like in the case of infrastructure, if we're going to be taking China's money in the area of environmental governance, which I think we have to because other countries are not stepping up, and certainly under Trump, the US is not going to be stepping up. And if we're going to be taking China on as a potential leader in environmental governance as well, we have to also make space for it as a partner and make the case to not only the Canadian domestic audience, but also start engaging and making arguments for why across the Indo-Pacific region, the ordinary person, the everyday kind of citizen of different countries will actually be better off if various types of trade wars and competitions are avoided, and if interdependence can be framed more as something that serves domestic strengths and serves the ordinary person better. I don't know exactly how to make that case. It's obviously a case-by-case basis. But I don't think we can just say we can't do it. I think we have to find, I think that a lot of what we've talked about today depends on selling it to a domestic audience. Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, do you think we have space to make China a partner? You talked about the transactional nature. What does this mean for Canada? Does Canada have any policy space left when it comes to China?
I think that, I mean, I would like to respectfully disagree with Juliet, not because of the needs and the objective facts, but because of the politics today. One thing I've noticed over many years is that when China wants equality and says it aims at equality with the United States or equalities with major powers, it always gets translated into American English as China wants to dominate the world. So every time when China claims a space as an equal, it's read in Washington, especially by the Republicans, as a desire to dominate. And so long as that's the case, the space for collaboration on those sorts of things, which, especially in areas where China has a comparative advantage, is very, very narrow indeed. However, and this is where I would say this, I see a glimmer of hope, perhaps, is that the fact is, yes, that Canada is a traditional multilateralist, and the fact that the United States and under Trump is going to be playing transactional politics among the big players and looking for deals among the big and ignoring the small. And the small get their voice in institutions, and multilateral institutions in particular. They will be looking for countries to preserve their voice. And that will be at least a small bore role for Canada in trying to, A, preserve multilateral institutions as best they can, and to work within them to preserve a voice for the others, and perhaps be interlocutors in Washington say, you know, the small do matter if they're all of them together. And if you leave them, if you abandon them, you're abandoning them to leadership by China. And that might actually cause a little bit of a wave. By the way, I don't know many of you noticed, but the Chinese premier just yesterday met with the leading figures of all the global financial institutions, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, as well as the China-led ones like the AIIB and the New Development Bank. So China is already looking ahead to working with multilateral institutions in a kind of sponsor preserver role. And this will be a challenge to the United States when they see that this actually leaves them further behind. So that's where I see the glimmer of hope, and maybe there's a role for Canada in perhaps whispering in the ear, you know, if you abandon the field, somebody else is going to pick up the prize.
Well, in terms of your glimmer of hope, I think you've made a good argument for ongoing participation and leadership by Canada in the CPTPP, which was our previous session, which I guess you weren't able to join. But
I heard it, yes.
Oh yeah, thank you for those comments. Dimitri, on the technology transfer front and the fact that, well, and also dealing with critical minerals, which you mentioned, I know there's been some talk a great deal of concern, in fact, about the over-reliance on China for critical minerals. The U.S. Defense Department has made some investments in Canada, I believe, already to start exploiting the resources that we have here, and there are other countries, of course, that do that. But in terms of sort of, I don't know, if you want to call it the North American perimeter and the basically free exchange of technology between Canada and the U.S., how is what's happening in the U.S. going to impact, or how is it impacting Canada?
How is it impacting Canada per se? Again, I think Canada is not directly affected or in a very explicit way affected by the technology competition, which I think is very much a China-U.S. area. But I guess one thing that the U.S. government has consistently done, regardless of whether it was the Trump administration one or the Biden administration or now a forthcoming Trump administration, is they focused almost squarely on the leading edge. And that's where the nature of the competition is. And they've neglected the lagging edge. And in so doing, they've neglected much of the world, most of the global south, a lot of middle countries. And I think that that's an area that, Canada can perhaps find some way of participating with partners in Asia Pacific and making sure that China isn't the only supplier of electronics and technology to the world that can't really afford the next iPhone 16 in that area. So that's where I would say Canada can find a technology space. Another area, and maybe this is kind of sidetracking a lot from your question, but where Canada can find a space in kind of the evolving competition and in a future Trump-run America is how it makes itself relevant and valuable, perhaps to the United States. And so if I was consulting or something, I would say, Canada needs to start describing itself as a maritime power and also an Arctic power. And I think one area there that kind of overlaps with technology, and this is based on a time I spent in Taiwan over the summer where I got to talk with technology people there, and we had people from Korea and Japan, is the area of maritime domain awareness. And I think that these are kind of niche areas where countries like Canada can try to get involved in understanding where can the United States see an opportunity for Canadian interests, Canadian capacity to be part of a bigger area and a bigger partnership that's not necessarily American-driven, right? So in the South China Sea, which Jeffrey maybe will comment on this at some point, but that's where the center of kind of tension or kinetic potential conflict is likely to be. That's an area that is exploited by China, but also other powers. Insofar as that it's hard to monitor, hard to see, and I think Taiwan is thinking very carefully about this. The Koreans and the Japanese are thinking very carefully about this in terms of how can they provide technology, how can they provide eyes, sensing, data in ways that are not explicitly military but are environmental. They involve fisheries, they involve conservation, right? And I think Canada has, a potential credible label on all of those, and so that's kind of another area where I think Canada could participate in the technology conversation.
If I can break in, Canada's already doing this. Canada is actively involved in maritime domain awareness with partners in the Indo-Pacific, especially by providing technology, especially in the area of fishing, for monitoring the so-called dark technology for monitoring dark ships, where ships that have turned off transponders to undertake fishing. So this is an area where Canada is already actively involved and are actively collaborating with our Indo-Pacific partners.
Well, Jeff, you're at the Naval War College, so I'd like to get your views on this issue of Canada as a maritime power. I don't know if power is the right word, but a maritime presence, and the Arctic, because of course that's a big issue in this country, and we know that China has ambitions in the Arctic and is increasingly active in the Arctic. And you'll also be aware that a very live political issue here is the question of the NATO contribution percentage of defense spending, which is clearly going to be an issue for the Trump administration. And right now, as you know, the Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, does conduct some freedom of navigation operations. It works with the U.S. Navy, usually tucked in behind a much bigger U.S. warship as it transits the Taiwan Straits, which is a very sensible thing to do, I think. But whether that's significant or not, or more symbolic, I'm not sure. Perhaps you could comment. But what are your views in terms of the Canadian role in the Indo-Pacific from a military perspective, given the deepening awareness of, from a U.S. military perspective, of a growing threat from China?
So you had answered this question in two parts. The first being, what is a corollary to U.S. China defense cooperation competition in the space in Indo-Pacific? What role does Canada have there? I would just caution. I would suggest that Canada needs to look specifically at that formulation of U.S. China relationships and understand the value that it derives from supporting the U.S. position, whether it's participating in transits of the Taiwan Strait, whether it's involved in sending warships to RIMPAC, whether or not it's engaging in other kind of training or military exercises within the region as part of like a broader kind of coalition of aligned U.S. participating partners. Mostly because I think the Trump administration is going to be very transactional in the way that it approaches its relations with China. And I don't know that what we see today with U.S. commitments to allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific will be the enduring structure that U.S. security kind of architecture takes in the region. Neither do I think the region is necessarily stable enough outside of U.S. interests to ensure what is it going to look like in a year's time. We're seeing in South Korea right now, an incredible amount of political uncertainty around the Yoon administration. Because of the martial law declaration just a couple of days ago. We're seeing, changes in Japan around leadership that could have impacts about their willingness to work with the United States. So whatever I think we had under the Biden administration in terms of this kind of collection of, global West, if you want to call them that, or like-minded partners, I think we've kind of reached a high water mark with respect to what that's going to look like. And I think that it's probably going to become much more complicated going forward. So as Canada tries to think about how to navigate that, I really do think that you can't take anything for granted. American support, the American position, things could change on a dime, and Canada could find itself way out in front without the backing of the United States, right? I mean, what you said, Hugh, participating in a transit behind a larger American warship. What happens if that American warship goes away, right? And Canada's out there by itself. So I think it really has to be an approach to the region. And this is the second part that's based on Canadian national security interests, and of course, those are really pronounced in the Arctic. They're really pronounced with respect to multilateralism in NATO. There's a huge amount of commitment that's necessary for Canada to remain engaged in Europe around support for Ukraine, in particular if the United States decides to pull away support under the Trump administration. Other NATO member states are going to have to lean in. And so maybe the Indo-Pacific is not the priority theater that we often identify it as. Simply because it is a region where there's a lot of security issues at play. So yeah, I think it's and in terms of calling itself a maritime power, I mean we just have to be realistic here with respect to the amount of scale that it would take to influence anything in the Indo-Pacific. You're looking at a fleet of a Chinese Navy of upwards of 250 warships and submarines and vessels and frigates. I mean, to buy into this region and to have any kind of impact on the overall strategic environment is a huge amount of cost. And Canada just really can't move the needle with that respect. I mean, at most 2 or 3, warships in the region that are Canadian. Obviously, very important strategic, symbolic kind of engagement there. And that's maybe where we should look for. I think I totally agree with the former speakers about looking for niche areas to be more impactful. But I would just caution, following the United States and its direct kind of competition towards China, because there's no telling where the Trump administration will move this in the coming months or years.
I think we have a few minutes left. If anybody wants to ask a question of our panelists, please go to the mic. And while you're doing that, I'll just ask Jeff one follow-up question. So you talked about the number of Chinese ships. I'm not sure if I'm accurate in saying this, but I believe the PLAN is now larger in total ships than the U.S. Navy. And there's an issue of the defense budget in the United States. And of course, it's not just about the number of ships, it's also about capital ships and aircraft carriers and so forth. But we see the Chinese defense budget going in one direction and the US defense budget, if not going the other direction, at least flatlining or threatened to flatlining. So how do you see this playing out under the Trump administration?
Well, Hugh, it's not just about budgets. It's about having the capability to build ships domestically. The U.S. Navy is incredibly concerned about this point. The Chinese Navy is the world's largest right now, and of course, most of it's focused in the Indo-Pacific. Right? They're not trying to maintain a global presence like the United States is. So, you can argue about quality versus quantity. You can argue about whether or not the Chinese Navy is capable in actually using the materials that it's developed. I mean, that's an open question. I think there's good debate happening within the U.S. and defense community around that. But I don't know one sailor in the United States who would relish a fight with China in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, and particularly around areas in its near abroad. So if you were thinking about a Taiwan contingency or the South China Sea. China has a huge amount of material value that it can bring into those areas to support its national security interests. And the United States just simply doesn't have a domestic capacity to build ships at scale, and China does, right? And it's been investing in that over decades. These are not things that can turn on a dime. They take multiple years and tens of billions of dollars worth of investment to scale back up. The United States is starting to make some kind of preliminary moves. We've also looked at a kind of outsourcing partnerships with other states that have greater capacity. I would just, again, caution that, states don't have permanent partners. They have kind of, temporary interests, and that's where states will work together. But if you're thinking about, how can the United States match Chinese manufacturing in terms of maintaining this kind of scale of production, it can't at this point. And that's just the reality. And there's no defense analysis that I know here in the United States that would think otherwise. It's a real strategic vulnerability.
Okay, Jeff, you didn't get to ask your question last time, so you're at the mic, so please go ahead. And just so that our panelists online know who you're addressing it to, would you indicate whether you would like them to speak or one of the panelists up here?
Jeff Nankerville, once again from the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Nice to see you, Jeff Reeves and Jeremy. My question is actually for Juliet, and it's about development assistance. And I missed the opening session this morning, but for the rest of the day, the topic really hasn't come up. And I'll start with an observation, and I should declare an interest that for 5 years, I was the person in the Government of Canada responsible for Canada's development assistance in Asia at a time a decade ago when you could describe the country program that we had in Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines, the program we opened in Myanmar and so on. You could say, here's what we've negotiated with local partners. Here are the priorities for the next 5 years of this program. Here's the budget going out. And it was kind of a coherent, recognizable thing. My impression in recent years is that the hoped for, when the departments were amalgamated, the idea in favor of that amalgamation was that the development assistance programs could more coherently, more directly serve Canadian foreign policy objectives. And my impression from talking to people throughout the region is that the opposite has happened, that the programs have kind of disappeared in their visibility. Even the people who run the programs can't tell you what the future of that program is in that country. It kind of bounces around depending on what global initiatives that country team gets a piece of. So in light of that, and with the Indo-Pacific Strategy announcement of $750 million for FinDev Canada as Canada's new-ish development finance institution to invest in green infrastructure in Asia, which has yet to be rolled out, but these things take time. With a new government potentially coming into office in Canada, what sort of ideas would you suggest to put forward for programs in the area of official development assistance, whether it's through lending or through grants, that would address some of these geopolitical issues for Canada that we've been talking about? Simple question.
Yeah, just give advice on how Canada should spend development dollars. This isn't my area so much in terms of advising the Canadian government, but I do think that when we look at how much China is investing in infrastructure, one of the problems that China has had is that, and the Chinese are the first that you'll hear complain about this, for the amount of money that they've invested in paying for infrastructure development across the world, it hasn't helped their reputation one bit. There's become an obsession in China with soft power, however that's defined, poorly defined, but it's this vague dream of like, gosh, if we've given $500 billion in infrastructure lending and development aid, development financing, why don't people like us any better? And so I think it's not advice for Canada, certainly, but in terms of that whole kind of world of development financing, it's, I guess, a kind of caution to just be less about kind of quantity and more about quality, obviously. But I also, I guess, I honestly think that there has to be a complete shift in the focus of, again, quantity, of raising GDP, of this and that, to look at the alternatives, look at the rise of trade wars, look at the rise of actual wars, and say, this is actually good for elites in some of these countries, like big infrastructure projects that are way too big actually to serve the everyday person. Those are really good for elites. We need to start saying who inequality, who big project spending in the world of development finance, be it development aid or infrastructure. We need to say that those are benefiting elites. Those are benefiting kind of performative people in power that want the status quo, and that they're really not benefiting the ordinary person. And so kind of, I think that Canada can do a lot in messaging of kind of trying to talk about what forms of development have not over the last 50, 60, 70 years benefited the everyday person, and that have funneled more into existing power structures, and how that has to really change strategically. And yeah, that's what I'd say.
Over this side.
St. Thomas University. Thanks. This whole conversation has reminded me why I find the United States so frightening. But Jeff, I have my question for you. Something I always remembered is Robert McNamara in The Fog of War talking about all his lessons. And one of the main lessons he learned from the Vietnam War was to try to see the problem from the opponent's side, which seems an obvious lesson, but nonetheless. Given what you said, is there anybody in the Pentagon who actually makes the effort to understand from the Chinese perspective why the United States going after it so aggressively might be interpreted in ways that could actually create the very problems supposedly they're trying to stop? Or is this just an entirely closed loop with people who have no perspective beyond their own narrow view?
100%. There's a massive amount of strategic empathy in the Pentagon across the armed services. We have fantastic foreign area officers who work on Asia, analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency that understand, completely how the Chinese would feel encircled, contained, how they are being villainized, how the China threat kind of narrative is shaping their environment. We understand it on the defense side. The problem is the defense doesn't lead policy, right? Civil relations in the United States means that if a civilian leadership gives orders to the military, we execute as long as those orders are legal. It doesn't matter. Well, we can give best military advice to the political class, and if they decide to reject it, then I mean, we are on the hook to implement whatever policy that they come up with. So I guess that my answer to you is, on the mill side, absolutely. On the politician side, no. I think that you've got most people trying to out-hawk each other with respect to their views of China. And I think that's just under the Trump administration. My understanding is that will be even more so as so many of our domestic issues about some of our challenges that we're having in terms of our own investment, in terms of our partnerships, we tend to look outside for the causes of those, and we look to China. And unfortunately, it's become a bipartisan sport to look around and say, okay, the reason this is happening is because the PRC is doing X, Y, or Z. So I think on the political side, no, there's very little appetite for anybody to step forward and say, hey, maybe they're not that bad. But on the mill side, you've got people clamoring, right? Hey, we need to take their strategic national security interests seriously, and not to the point where we're going to compromise on our own national security values, but we should work those into our strategies. Today we actually have the commander of Indo-Pacific here at the Naval Postgraduate School, and he's going to talk later this afternoon. Admiral Paparo, when he talks about American strategy towards Asia, is very sensitive to the idea of what the PRC is perceiving around American activity and allied activity. The challenge, of course, is he's charged with America's defense. Point number one. Point number two is he takes his direction from the president and the Secretary of Defense, and that's unfortunately, or fortunately, that's a function. It's a feature of America's system, not a bug. But no, on the defense side, absolutely.
Thank you. Craig?
Hi. Craig Wilson. Half my career was in China with Foreign Affairs and now the Foresight Network of University of Ottawa. A couple of, I suppose, home movie points on just history. I used to be a trade negotiator early in my career and sat in Geneva and listened to the Americans and the Australians beat up on the Europeans about how they needed to open up to globalization. Context point being, America is completely reversing itself, at least under Trump. Whether that will continue leads to a question that I'll try to put at the end. The other is a similar context. You mentioned the impact of the Chinese BRI, but frankly, having been there for over 2 decades, the BRI was preceded by the Shibu-Dakaifa Western Development Strategy, and before that by what was being done under Zhao. And I wandered around Xinjiang in 1987, and went out to the railhead of the railway they were building in 1987, about 20 kilometers outside of Urumqi. And I was surprised to learn, with a colleague, and we were just talking. We'd been to Turfan the day before, so it was all context. But they were building a railway to Tehran. They got it done in Christmas of 2015. And in January, they ran through a high-speed, a container train all the way to Tehran. The next year, they ran it all the way under the channel in both times in 2 weeks to under the channel into London. My point being, these things aren't recent. They're long-term, and they follow through and get them done. And I guess I would throw, for the last context point, the Chinese are building a high-speed railway. They're already, I think, through Laos, because they're at Vientiane, and trying to work their way south. Plus, they're building major highways. And the one thing you hear, and I probably still pay a lot of attention to Asia and Africa, the people in those places love what that development brings. It isn't for the elites, it's the average person. Now, you're running into Chinese triads investing in casinos and doing things in Cambodia that is going to need some work, but the Chinese strike me as being pretty responsive to that. And as a comment, perhaps, that I'd like people to comment on, do they learn better from their mistakes over time? I make that in the context of 2 things. that American commitment to globalization has been 180 degrees reversed. Canada is really complex. That's a complicated response for Canada because we still gain from globalization. So we're on the opposite tack from the Americans, and this is going to be a difficult issue going forward. My question is, looking at that context, it seems to me one of the defining issues of the next 2 decades is the loss of agency of the U.S. And how they deal with it. What we're hearing is they're going to compete and attempt to dominate. I just refer to the movie Oppenheimer about science. It's pretty much international. The second is how these issues impact Canada, and the Canadians may make the opposite point, but what were we going to do to see globalization maintained in some form, bringing back institutions that work for a global rules-based order that works for the whole globe, not just 1/8 of it. And I think that's enough that you got the points. One can point to a lot of issues, but fragmentation is not something we want to see. The amount being spent on defense, the American number I've seen from things on Substack is about the same as my calculation, somewhere between 1.8 trillion and 2 trillion a year. That's a big obstacle for the Americans to overcome over time.
Others to ask a question as well. Any comments?
I can wait on that if you want to ask let other questions come in.
Okay, let's get the last 2 questions in.
Okay, Adol Zianibe, and I'm a recent undergraduate at Carleton University in international business with a concentration in marketing and trade. So I guess my question has to do with the comment that Donald Trump has said, I would say this past week, and it was in relation to BRICS and the idea of them creating a new currency. And the fact that, like, you know, if they create a new currency, there's going to be repercussions and so on. So my question's a little bit multifaceted. And so just to start off from it is, number one, you know, how likely would BRICS be able to create a new currency? I know there's a lot of geopolitical issues with the BRICS in general. For example, with China and India, they have a lot of border disputes and so on. I'm not sure to what degree that affects the economy in a way, where they can kind of like all, I guess, get along to be able to create this so-called new currency. However, if they did, I guess, number one, how would that affect the global West? And then as well, in terms of Donald Trump stating that, you know, they will take repercussions, what type of repercussions should we expect?
Okay, thank you, and we'll get the last question on the table as well.
Hello, my name is Steve Zhu. I'm a research scholar at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. My question is a bit more hard security oriented. So we know that Trump is looking to get Canada to bump up its defense spending, and a lot of that will probably go towards capability development. Canada has a bit of a selective industrial policy when it comes to its own defense industrial base, especially when it comes to things like ships. Will there be a potential American expectation as the Canada looks to bolster its military capabilities to buy more American equipment to get it out the door faster?
Okay, so 3 questions. I think the first one is about development assistance, about at least another reserve currency, and the third one on defense issues. So who wants to respond? Juliet?
I have a really broad comment because there was so much in there. Maybe we can talk after, and also I'm going to try to do both. But the broader comment that I wanted to make is that when we think about, you know, how China is pushing through its own infrastructure developments, or the idea of a BRICS currency, I think these. I just want to start I'm not going to really answer it. I want to start the conversation with going back 2 steps and saying China has been outside of a lot of the global institutions when it comes to development aid or things like that. You know, the UN was actually, and the Asian Development Bank were 2 organizations that were spearheading, kind of planning out infrastructure development in northern Laos before the train came, right? So China in some ways took up the mantle of long-standing ADB plans for infrastructure development and tried to fit itself into that. On the environmental politics front, China is trying to fit itself into the UN system in many ways. It does most of its work bilaterally still, but it's making efforts to go multilateral. And when it comes to kind of just the financial structures overall, currency wars and whatnot. I think it's just good to start the conversation from the point where a lot of times we focus on China and what moves that they think they're going to make, or what moves might the BRICS countries be making to gain some footing in the global system, and talk about how they're going to take over and get so much influence. But we have to recognize that the global rules-based system it's a bunch of rules that are built for the U.S. So when we talk about, what BRICS might bring to the table if they were kind of trying to counter that, we really have to remember that the rules are made by the country that's, most powerful. And so I just wanted to, start the conversation there and remember who's the biggest player at the table and who makes the rules and plays the game, the game that they play.
Okay, well, we'll go around the table. Jeremy, yes, please.
Well, first of all, we're talking about strategic competition. And in the context of strategic competition, the United States plays with the best hand it has. And the two best hands it has is the US dollar and the US market. So that's why tariffs are so important, and that's why Trump is threatening the BRICS. It's not threatening, what the BRICS are doing is actually defensive against U.S. smart sanctions, second-generation sanctions, which are focused on the use of the U.S. dollar. So mostly what's going to happen out of the BRICS thing is probably not a new currency. What they're looking at more is new forms of interbank transfers, which will avoid the SWIFT system, which is dominated by U.S. private banking system, which the United States Treasury can supervise. So that's what's going to happen. I doubt very much if a new currency will emerge that quickly. But what we probably are seeing a kind of fragmentation, and there's certainly going to be a defensive. As the competition heats up, China and Russia and other countries which are subject to sanctions, Iran, will find ways of getting around the dollar-based sanctions system. How will that work out over time? I guess only time will tell. And again, the tariffs are on the table partly because the U.S. market is still the world's largest market. If, as a result of Trump tariffs, the U.S. no longer is the world's largest market, those tariffs will actually become less effective over time.
Dimitri?
Sure. I guess I would just double what Jeremy just said about the U.S. dollar. I mean, one of the reasons the U.S. dollar is so dominant is because it's the cheapest, most effective form of exchange. And really, the sanctions are what has been pushing countries like Russia and China and others to consider other options. And if we imagine that the Trump administration is probably, I would say, less interested in sanctions relative to tariffs, then maybe some of that impetus for an alternative currency will go away. In terms of what it could look like, I agree it would be some sort of bilateral swap, and there's versions of that that include basket currencies, also some central bank digital currencies, but those are really going to be useful for trading partners that have very stable, predictable trade flows between them, and I don't think it's going to be very significant. On the broader question, I think, Craig, on kind of, what's the case for globalization, I just want to push back to some extent on a common narrative that, and this is probably, Trump 2016, the whole kind of backlash against globalization. I think that narrative made a lot of sense, that people were upset with globalization. People in the United States were upset about outsourcing and kind of the gutting of America's industrial base and all of that. But we just had an incredible year of elections where, you all know this, incumbent governments lost left and right everywhere, and including in the United States. And I would not say that the Biden administration was very much pro-globalization. It was, industrial policy, subsidy. And so people are just upset, right? And we don't fully understand why they're upset. But chances are they're not going to be particularly happy with what they get with Trump either. And so I don't know what to tell you. I think at some point maybe the pendulum swings back, and higher prices and with the securitization of the global economy will result in higher prices. And people are sensitive to that, and they'll be upset to that. So maybe that will be what brings us back to kind of a globalization conversation.
Thank you. Very good comments to put things into context. Jeff, I guess the last word goes to you.
Yeah, on defense spending, Canada and the United States have a defense production sharing agreement that has resulted, since the late 1950s in a really dense network of an integrated defense supply chain, right? So American companies subcontract to Canadian companies subtract to American companies on things, related from aerospace all the way through other kind of military systems. So, I think probably increased defense spending would follow along these predictable kind of bilateral, supply chains. I do think, though, that there's, some value in looking at the recent MOU signed between Canada, Finland, and the United States, for example, on icebreakers and polar kind of vessels putting together, right? There's value add that Canada can bring to the relationship on defense and defense production and research and development that the United States understands, and it can supplement for areas where the United States is underinvested. So I don't necessarily think, I don't think that the result would be, hey, you have to buy American if you're going to increase defense spending. I think it's more complicated than that, and I think it would follow traditional, patterns of economic exchange and production, in particular, because I think it benefits both sides.
Well, thank you very much. It just remains for me to ask or to turn the mic over to Bijan, who is going to give us a final wrap-up.